Okay, so now we need to talk about formal logic, and what we mean by that is if-then statements or conditional statements, but we're going to call them if-then statements. And if-then statements play a very large role on LSAT games. It turns out that there are things you can and cannot figure out from if-then statements, and of course the LSAT is testing you on what you can and cannot figure out. Formal logic is something that everybody comes to know and love, and actually might very well stick with you for literally a few years after you take the LSAT. So this particular lesson is going to be divided into 4 parts. The first, we're going to talk about what we really mean by if-then statements and what you can and cannot figure out from them. By the way, what you can figure out is going to be known as the contrapositive. And again, that is a term that you will come to love. Second, we need to talk about how to really identify the contrapositive, how to really see the contrapositive. Number 3, we need to talk about how to translate rules into if-then form. And again, you can't translate all rules into if-then form. Just like you can't translate all rules into blocks, you can't translate all rules in if-then form, but some you can, and some you really do need to do that. And then finally, number 4, we're going to talk about 2 special if-then rules that I actually believe is unique to this DVD. The way this is going to go is I'm going to talk about each part just separately, so you're not going to really have to worry about using your training manual as I'm talking to you about it, but I'm going to break it down part by part. So I'll talk to you about it a little bit, and then we're going to review it. I'm going to read directly in the training manual. Then I'll talk to you about the second part and read it over the training manual, so on and so forth. So the best way to kind of introduce you to these if-then statements is to start in the abstract. This is a little bit tricky, without a doubt, and people will struggle with this initially, but it's just to illustrate to you how challenging it can be. So we are going to start in the abstract, and then we'll go into the practical, and you'll see how it makes more sense. So right off the bat, what if I were to tell you, if X, then, as indicated by this arrow, if X, then Y. The question is, which of the following statements are logical deductions from this if-then statement? In other words, if I know if X, then Y, we're just going to assume that to be true. Which of the following deductions can be made? That is, which of the following must be true? Well, you can think about this a little bit. If Y, then X. If no X, then no Y. Or finally, if no Y, then no X. If you need to, go ahead and pause the DVD and think about which of the following is a logical deduction from this if-then statement. It turns out that the only deduction that can be made from this if-then statement is C, if no Y, then no X. A and B are not legitimate deductions. C is going to be known as the contrapositive. We'll come back to that in just a minute. But you might be wondering, well, why is that? How is C a deduction and A and B not? Well, let's talk about a little bit more practical formal logic, and you'll be able to see why the contrapositive is the only deduction that can be made from a conditional statement. So instead of saying if X, then Y, what if I were to say, if it's a rabbit, then it's an animal? I think everybody would agree. If it's a rabbit, then it's an animal, right? So let's write that down as if R for rabbit, then A for animal. So in this case, instead of X and Y, we have R and A. Well, doing the same thing. Is it true that if it's an animal, then it's a rabbit? Well, absolutely not. Just because it's an animal, it could be a cat or a dog or a pig or a fish. On the other hand, if I was saying if it's not a rabbit, if not rabbit, then not animal. Well, certainly not. Again, if it's not a rabbit, it could certainly be an animal. However, what if I were to say, if not an animal, then not a rabbit? Well, yeah. If it's not an animal, it's not a rabbit. This C, if not an animal, then not a rabbit, is known as the contrapositive. Okay, so what's really going on here? And before we really talk about identifying the contrapositive, let's again talk about what's going on here. The if element, that is, if it's a rabbit, we're going to call like a trigger. The fact that we have a rabbit, if we have a rabbit, that will trigger a certain conclusion. And we can come to the conclusion that if it's a rabbit, then it must be an animal. We can come to that conclusion. So A, the fact that it's an animal, that is our conclusion. At the same time, we also have another if, another trigger, if it's not an animal. We can come to the conclusion if it's not a rabbit. Well, looking back at what I had just written down, again, taking a look at number 1, what if we have an animal? What if we have a trigger that it's an animal? Well, we can't come to the conclusion that it's a rabbit. It may or may not be a rabbit. Or number 2, if I say if it's not a rabbit, if I have that trigger, what conclusion can we come to? Well, again, we don't know. If it's not a rabbit, maybe it's an animal and maybe it's not an animal. However, again, number 3, if it's not an animal, if we have that trigger, we can come to the conclusion that it's definitely not a rabbit. So this is your introduction to the idea of the contrapositive, and what the LSAT is testing you on is that if they give you an if-then rule, like if R then A or if rabbit then animal, they're testing you. Do you know that these first 2 are not logical deductions? And do you know that this third is a logical deduction, again known as the contrapositive? Again, they're not going to use the word contrapositive, but you're going to need to be able to find and see the contrapositive. So that's kind of an introduction to formal logic, and it's a little bit tricky, but the best way to look at this is for you to take out your training manual, please, and go to formal logic. Notice it says formal logic, if-then statements, and it says the contrapositive is the only deduction that can be made from if-then statement. Okay. What I would like you to do, please, is just read over, go ahead and press pause, Roman numeral 1, and 1, 2, and 3, and number 4 as well. Take a minute, just read that over, and you'll see kind of that's what we just discussed. Okay, well, notice number 4. It says contrapositive, switch and negate the elements. Don't worry, it says switch and to or and vice versa. We'll come back to that in just a minute. But again, to find the contrapositive, what do? We switch and negate the elements. So again, going back to if R then A. To find the contrapositive, that is in number 3, notice what we did. We switched the elements, we switched A and R, and we negated A and R. So again, if I say if R, then A, the contrapositive, again, looking at number 3, is if not A, then not R. Switch and negate the elements. So going back to our abstract formal logic, if X, then Y. To find the contrapositive, what we do is we switch the elements and negate the elements. So the contrapositive would be if not Y, then not X. Okay. Well, that can be a little bit tricky. And for, I would say, most students, what you're really going to want to do is treat this as a formula. Treat the contrapositive as a formula. Don't worry so much about, oh, well, why is this the only deduction that can be made? You have to know this is the only deduction that can be made. Let me give you an analogy to that. We know, like, for example, the area of a circle is pi r squared. Maybe you remember that from high school. Okay, why is the area of a circle pi r squared? I have no idea why that is, but I know it is. Fine, that's just the way it is. That's the formula. That's going to be the same thing with the contrapositive. Now notice, going back to your training manual, it does say under contrapositive switch and negate the elements, it says switch and to or and vice versa. What in the world does that mean? Well, let's see. What if I were to say, if it's a rabbit, then A, it's an animal, and it breathes. Right? I mean, if it's a rabbit, then it's an animal, then it breathes. Okay. Contrapositive, a little tricky here. We're going to switch and negate the elements and switch and to or. So what does that mean? I know that if it doesn't breathe, That is, if not B, or if it's not an animal, then it's not a rabbit. Or switching my and to an or, right? If it doesn't breathe or it's not an animal, then it's not a rabbit. Again, treat this as a formula. Fine, just switch and negate everything. To find the contrapositive, I'm just going to switch and negate all the terms, including switching and to or to and. Well, let's talk about the other example, switching or to and. If I were to say if it's a rabbit, then it's a boy, B, or a girl. Agreed? If it's a boy or a girl. Okay, if it's a rabbit, has to be a boy or a girl. Well, the contrapositive, again, switching and negating the elements, switching and to or and switching or to and. The contrapositive, therefore, is if it's not a boy and it's not a girl, then it's not a rabbit. You can't say or. You can't say if it's not a boy or it's not a girl. If it's not a boy, it could still be a rabbit because it'd be a girl rabbit. If it's not a girl, it could still be a rabbit, it could be a boy rabbit. So again, we are switching or to and. So that is a little bit tricky. So what I would like you to do, please, is we have this little exercise for you in the training manual. It says formal logic exercise. We have 8 exercises for you. And what I would like you to do is see if you can write down the contrapositive for all 8. Go ahead and pause. Again, switch and negate the elements. Switch and to or. And then I will write down the contrapositive for number 2, 4, 6, and 8. That is the abstract elements. So go ahead and press pause. See if you can write down the contrapositive for each. Okay, well, you should have noticed that number 1 and 2 are very similar. Number 3 and 4 are very similar, and so on and so forth. So that's why I'm just going to do the abstract formal logic. So the contrapositive for number 2 is going to be, if not y, then not x. Again, switching and negating the elements. For number 4, again, we have to switch and to or. So that's going to be, if not y or not z, then not x. Number 6, again, switching or to and. If not y and not z, then not x. And then finally, number 8 gets a little bit tricky because we have if x, then not y. So switching and negating there would be if y, then not x. So notice on the right side, it has not y. So negating that would give me y. So that's a little bit tricky. And if you feel yourself struggling with this, then you're in the similar boat as many students, and that's okay. But that's the beauty of this DVD. If you'd like, feel free to rewind and go ahead and rewind 3, 4, 5 times. Make sure you have this down. It's really not going to be sufficient for you to have a basic understanding of this. Make sure you understand how to switch and negate these elements.